Every farm has a graveyard of old machines. Most folks don't call it that. They call it the back 40, or the equipment lot, or sometimes just behind the barn where Margaret won't see it. But it's a graveyard all the same, a place where iron and steel go when the world decides they're no longer useful, when newer and faster and shinier replaces them, and the old ways get pushed back into the weeds and the rust. In the summer of 1984, there was one such graveyard on the western edge of Callaway County, Indiana, or at least that's what it looked like to most people who drove past it on Route 46. They'd see the rows of old equipment through the wire fence, sickle bar mowers gone orange with rust, an old corn picker with its snapping rolls seized tight with decades of dried cob silk, an ancient grain elevator with its wooden buckets rotted half away. They'd shake their heads and mutter something about the Millers always being pack rats, about how Harold Miller needed to clean up that place, about what an eyesore it all was. What they didn't see, what nobody seemed to see anymore, was that Harold Miller knew exactly where everything was and exactly what everything did and exactly how to make it work again if he had to. That knowledge, most people in Callaway County had decided by 1984, was about as useful as an 8-track tape in a world that had just discovered the compact disc. They were wrong. And on the 3rd day of August, in the middle of the worst electrical storm to hit the county in 40 years, they were going to find out just how wrong they were. Harold Eugene Miller was 67 years old in the summer of 1984, though he looked older to those who didn't know him well and younger to those who did. He stood 5 feet 10 in his work boots, Red Wing logger boots, resoled 3 times since he'd bought them in 1971. And he carried himself with the particular economy of motion that comes from 60 years of doing physical work without wasting a single movement. His hands were the kind of hands that told a story before a man ever opened his mouth. Thick-fingered, scarred across the knuckles, the left thumb slightly crooked from a baling wire incident in 1952 that had never healed quite right. He had lived on the Miller farm his entire life. Born in the same upstairs bedroom where his father had been born, on land that his grandfather, Heinrich Miller, who had come over from the Rhineland with $20 and a determination that bordered on stubbornness, had broken from hardwood forest in 1889. The farmhouse was a 2-story clapboard structure that had been white once and was now the color of old cream, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and a kitchen addition tacked on the back in 1947 when Harold's mother, Edna, had finally gotten running water and declared that she would not carry another bucket from the pump as long as she lived. Harold had taken over the farm when his father passed in 1964. The same year, he sometimes noted with a thin smile that he'd bought the Massey Ferguson. He'd run it as a mixed operation for most of his working years. Some corn, some soybeans, a small dairy herd, a few hogs, chickens for eggs. He and his wife, Ruth, had raised 3 children on that farm, sent them all to college, buried Ruth in the little cemetery plot at the edge of the North Field in 1979, and watched as farming itself changed so completely around him that he sometimes felt like a man standing still while the world ran past him at highway speed. He had retired from active farming in 1981, leasing the cropland to a neighbor's son and letting the dairy herd go entirely. It wasn't the work he minded. Harold Miller would have worked until the day they put him in the ground, and he knew it. It was the economics. The interest rates in 1981 had climbed toward 20%, and every dollar he borrowed to plant had to earn back $1.20 just to break even. He'd run the numbers on a yellow legal pad at the kitchen table one February night, Ruth's old reading lamp throwing its yellow circle of light over the columns of figures, and he had known. It was time. But retirement, for Harold Miller, was not what it was for other men. He did not buy a fishing boat. He did not move to Florida. He did not play golf. Instead, he maintained his equipment, every piece of it, from the 1964 Massey Ferguson 135 that had been his first major purchase as farm owner to the International Harvester grain drill that dated to 1958, with the same careful attention that a librarian gives to old books. He kept his tools clean and his machines greased. He read the implement manuals the way other men read the Bible, slowly and with the understanding that the text would reveal new things to a man who was paying proper attention. The neighbors called him a pack rat. His son-in-law, a man named Kevin who sold insurance in Indianapolis and had soft hands and strong opinions, called him a hoarder. The county agricultural extension agent, a young fellow named Brad Kowalski who had a degree from Purdue and a truck with a cassette player, had once suggested, carefully, diplomatically, that Harold might consider a farm equipment auction as a way to monetize underutilized assets. Harold had looked at Brad Kowalski for a long moment without saying anything. Then he had offered him a cup of coffee, which Brad had accepted. They had drunk their coffee in silence, and Brad had driven away, and Harold had never heard the phrase monetize underutilized assets again, at least not from that direction. What Harold had in his equipment lot, and in his machine shed, and in the old corn crib that he'd converted to storage, and in the loft of the north barn, was 40 years of agricultural history. There were hand tools going back to his grandfather's time, wooden-handled scythes, a hay fork with a cracked handle wrapped tight with electrician's tape, a set of horse collars hanging from a wooden peg worn smooth by a generation of horsehair. There was an old hit-and-miss engine on a wooden frame that he'd gotten from a neighbor's estate sale in 1968, thinking he might restore it someday. There was a corn sheller, a fanning mill for cleaning grain, a hand-crank cream separator that he'd bought from the bakers up the road when they quit dairying in 1971. And there, in the darkest corner of the machine shed, half hidden behind a stack of old aluminum irrigation pipes and a roll of chicken wire, was the machine that would matter in August of 1984, a power takeoff generator, a heavy-duty unit built by Wind Power Manufacturing of Newton, Iowa, sometime in the late 1940s. It had a cast-iron housing painted in a shade of green that had faded to the color of an old army blanket, and it had an input shaft with a spline coupling designed to mate with the standard 1 3/8-inch, 6-spline PTO shaft that had been the industry standard since the late 1930s. Harold had bought it in 1969 at an estate auction when the Hendersons had sold out and moved to Arizona. He had paid $11 for it. He remembered the exact price, the way you remember anything you've ever paid for at auction, the peculiar specificity of those arithmetic moments. And he had brought it home and serviced it and run it once on the MF-135 to make sure it worked. And then he had slid it into the corner of the machine shed where it had sat for 15 years, waiting. Ruth had asked him, once, what he was saving it for. This was back in 1972, maybe 1973, when the Rural Electrical Cooperative had finished stringing lines to the last few farms in the county, and the age of the farm generator had seemed well and truly over. Harold had thought about the question for a while. He was a man who thought carefully before speaking, which was one of the things that made him seem slow to people who mistook deliberation for slowness. For when we need it, he had said. Ruth had given him a look that combined affection and exasperation in the proportion that is only achieved by a woman who has been married to the same man for more than 20 years. And when will that be? Don't know, Harold said. But we'll know when it is. To understand what happened in August of 1984, you have to understand what Callaway County looked like in those years, and what farming looked like in Indiana in those years. And you have to understand the particular sadness of watching a world you built with your own hands being dismantled piece by piece and replaced with something faster and shinier and more expensive and more fragile. The 1970s had been a strange decade for American agriculture. Commodity prices had spiked during the early years of the decade, driven partly by a massive grain sale to the Soviet Union in 1972 that Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz had called the deal of the century. Corn hit $3 a bushel, then $4. Land prices exploded. Farmers who had been pinching pennies for a generation suddenly found themselves land-rich in a way that nobody had anticipated. And the banks, Lord help us, the banks, were falling over themselves to lend against the inflated collateral. Get big or get out, Earl Butz had famously said. Plant fence row to fence row. And so they had. Farmers all over the Corn Belt borrowed money to buy their neighbors' land when it came up for sale, which it did more and more as the older generation died or retired. They borrowed to buy bigger tractors, bigger combines, bigger grain bins. They borrowed to drain the wetland corners of their fields and pull the hedgerows that had broken the wind since their grandfather's time. They had become, in the language of the agricultural economists at the land-grant universities, efficient producers. Harold Miller had watched all of this with the quiet skepticism of a man who had read enough history to know that what goes up will come down, and that the distance of the fall is approximately equal to the height of the rise. He had not borrowed to expand. He had not pulled his hedgerows. He had continued farming the same 320 acres that his grandfather had broken, using the same conservative crop rotations, maintaining the same equipment he already owned. He had been called old-fashioned for this, behind the times, resistant to progress, lacking in ambition. In 1978, a young loan officer at the county farm bank had told him to his face that he was leaving money on the table by not expanding. Harold had nodded politely and said thank you and driven home in the Massey Ferguson, which he had chosen to drive to town that day because it was a nice day and he liked the way the old tractor ran in cool weather. Then, in 1979, the price of oil doubled overnight. Interest rates began to climb toward the sky. The Soviet grain embargo of 1980, ordered by President Carter in response to the invasion of Afghanistan, collapsed the export market. Corn prices fell. Land values, which had seemed permanent as bedrock, began to slide. By 1981, when Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve pushed interest rates to levels not seen since the Gilded Age, the slide became a freefall. The farm crisis, that was what they would call it in the history books later, with the capital letters that confer respectability on collective suffering, had come to Callaway County, Indiana, and it had come hard. By the summer of 1984, Harold Miller had watched 11 of his neighbors lose their farms. Some had gone quietly. They'd worked out a deal with the bank, handed over the keys, moved to town, or moved away entirely. Some had gone loudly, with foreclosure notices posted on courthouse doors and sheriff's deputies standing in farmyards while auctioneers chanted their rapid-fire cadences over the wreckage of a family's livelihood. He had driven past the Bergman place in the spring of '84, 3 months after Walt Bergman had walked into the grain elevator office and handed in his keys, and driven to his brother's house in Columbus and not come back. And he had seen the for sale sign in the yard and the grass already going rank around the farmhouse foundation. And he had felt something in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but contained elements of both. The land did not care about any of this. The land was still there, black and patient, waiting for whoever would come next. Dale Hartwell was 31 years old in the summer of 1984, which meant he had been born in 1953, which meant he had no memory of farming before the combine, and the center pivot irrigation system, and the automatic bulk milk tank. His father, Gene Hartwell, had run a modest 40-cow dairy on the south side of Callaway County for 30 years, milking twice a day with a simple pipeline milking system installed in 1965, putting his milk in a standard 500-gallon bulk tank, selling to the Prairie Farms Cooperative that sent a truck every other day. Gene Hartwell had not been a wealthy man, but he had not been a poor one either. He owned his land free and clear by 1975. He sent Dale and his sister Karen to Indiana University on the proceeds of 30 years of careful management and the occasional lucky year when corn prices cooperated. He retired to a house in Martinsville in 1979 and handed the farm to Dale with a piece of advice that Dale had not, perhaps, taken seriously enough. "It's a good farm," Gene had said, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse the evening before Dale took over, the Indiana twilight stretching long over the fields. "Don't mess with it more than you have to." Dale had nodded. But Dale had also come back from 4 years in Bloomington with a degree in agricultural economics and a head full of ideas about economies of scale and marginal cost curves and vertical integration, and the farm he'd grown up on. 40 cows, 300 acres, a small dairy barn that smelled of milk and ammonia, and the particular sweetness of alfalfa hay, had looked to him like something from another era. Something quaint. Something that needed to be replaced. He had expanded aggressively. By 1983, he had borrowed money from 3 different lenders to build a new dairy facility on the south end of the property. A freestall barn capable of housing 800 cows, with an automated feeding system that ran on a computer installed in the farm office, and a double 12 parallel milking parlor equipped with automatic takeoff units and electronic identification tags on each cow. He had a refrigerated bulk milk system with 6 1,000-gallon tanks. He had automatic manure scrapers, automatic waterers, a total mixed ration system controlled by a computer program he'd bought from a company in Fort Wayne for $4,000. The whole operation had cost, by the time the last contractor had been paid and the last loan had been signed, somewhere in the vicinity of $1.4 million, of which approximately $1.1 million was financed at interest rates ranging from 14.5% to 17.2%, depending on which lender you were talking about, and what month the note had been written. Dale Hartwell was, by any measure, mortgaged to the hilt. His monthly debt service was $16,800. To cover that payment, to make payroll for the 3 full-time employees he'd taken on, to pay for feed and veterinary services and fuel and repairs, he needed every one of his 650 producing cows to be healthy and productive every single day. He did not allow himself to think too often about what would happen if something went wrong. He had a backup plan for some contingencies. He had a maintenance contract with the company that had installed the milking equipment. He had a veterinarian on a retainer agreement. He had, he believed, thought through the major risks. What he did not have, what had never truly occurred to him to acquire, was a backup source of electrical power for his farm. The Rural Electric Cooperative had not had a major outage in 14 years. The last one, in 1970, had lasted 6 hours and been caused by a truck driver who had misjudged the height of an overpass on County Road 800 and taken out a distribution transformer. Since then, the co-op had upgraded their lines, installed automated switching equipment, and achieved a reliability record that Brad Kowalski at the Extension Office was fond of citing when he talked to farm groups about infrastructure. Dale Hartwell had not worried about the power grid. He had worries enough of his own. In the summer of 1984, with milk prices suppressed by the federal milk diversion program that the Reagan administration had introduced as a measure to reduce the dairy surplus, and with his operating costs running 10 to 15% above what he'd projected when he'd built the facility, Dale Hartwell was not sleeping well. He was not sleeping well, and he was not eating well, and he had started keeping a bottle of bourbon in the bottom drawer of the farm office desk, which was something his father had never done and which Dale told himself he would stop doing as soon as things settled down. He had 650 cows in that barn. He had 5,000 gallons of milk in those tanks. He had a mountain of debt and a thin margin and the particular kind of desperate pride that comes from having committed everything you have and everything you are to a single proposition, and from not yet being certain whether that proposition will save you or destroy you. July of 1984 was the hottest month in Indiana since 1936, and August came in like it intended to make July look mild. The corn in the fields began to fire at the edges of the leaves by the first week of the month, the green going yellow and then brown in the afternoons, the stalks standing with a stiffness that was partly strength and partly dehydration. Old Tom Decker, who had the farm on the other side of the road from Harold Miller and who had been farming Callaway County since 1947, said it reminded him of the year before a bad drought. Harold Miller watered his kitchen garden twice a day, morning and evening, using the same aluminum wheel-line irrigation system he'd installed in 1966. He was growing tomatoes and sweet corn and green beans and a row of sunflowers that Ruth had started planting in 1971 and that Harold continued to plant every year, partly for the seeds which he put out for the birds and partly because they had a way of facing east in the morning and west in the evening that he found, for reasons he could not have articulated, deeply satisfying. He listened to the weather forecast on the radio every morning at 5:30, while the coffee was percolating. Harold Miller had never owned a drip coffee maker, preferring his old aluminum percolator that had been a wedding present in 1953 and that made coffee the way coffee was supposed to be made, hot and strong, and without any reliance on paper filters. The forecasters had been talking for several days about a pattern developing, a high-pressure system stalling over the eastern Gulf states, a cold front dropping down from Canada, the two systems meeting somewhere over the Ohio Valley with the particular violence that accompanies the collision of very different air masses in high summer. On the morning of August 3rd, the forecast said severe thunderstorm watch. Harold finished his coffee, rinsed his cup, and went out to the machine shed. He spent 2 hours that morning working on the PTO generator, draining the old oil from the gearbox and replacing it with fresh 90-weight gear lube, greasing the splined input shaft, checking the brushes and the slip rings on the alternator head, testing the output terminals with his old triplet voltohm meter that he'd bought from a Sears catalog in 1963, and that still read true. The generator checked out fine. It had always been a solid piece of equipment. The wartime-era American manufacturers had built things with a solidity that reflected their awareness that the machines would be used in conditions that manufacturers of peacetime equipment didn't have to consider. Harold ran a short piece of heavy-gauge extension cord from the output terminal to a drop light and checked the voltage. 118 volts, clean and steady. He nodded to himself. He did not know, on the morning of August 3rd, that he would be using the generator that day. He simply believed in maintenance, in readiness, in the habit of keeping things in working order against the day when working order might be required. It was a principle his father had taught him and his grandfather had taught his father before that, a principle that had come down through 3 generations on this piece of Callaway County ground, without ever being written down because it had never needed to be written down. You simply lived it, the way you live the knowledge of how to read a sky or judge the moisture content of corn by pressing a kernel between your thumb and forefinger. He put the generator back in its corner, covered it with a tarpaulin to keep the dust off the terminals, and went in for lunch. The storm came from the northwest at 4:47 in the afternoon, which Harold knew precisely because he had been sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sky, when he heard the first low mutter of thunder in the direction of the county line. He had been watching the sky for an hour by then, the particular greenish-yellow light that had settled over the fields telling him things that the radio could only approximate. It was not the sort of sky that made Harold Miller nervous. He had lived through the Armistice Day storm of 1940 as a young man, had watched his father lash the barn doors shut with rope while the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours and the snow came in sideways off the northwest. He had lived through the tornado of 1965 that had taken the roof off the corn crib and deposited it in a neatly collapsed accordion of corrugated steel in the middle of the south field. He had farmed through drought and flood, through commodity collapses and credit crunches, through the loss of neighbors and the loss of markets and the loss of everything he thought he understood about how agriculture was supposed to work. Weather was weather. It came, it did what it was going to do, and then it went. The best a man could do was to pay attention and be ready. He set down his iced tea, went inside, and called the Rural Electric Cooperative. The woman who answered, she had a voice he recognized, a sturdy, flat-voweled Hoosier voice that told you she'd grown up on a farm and hadn't forgotten it, told him that they were aware of the storm system and that crews were on standby. How long for repairs if the substation goes? Harold asked. There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds too long for his comfort. Well, Mr. Miller, we'd certainly hope it wouldn't come to that. How long? Harold said. Not impolitely, but not as a question either. The Whitfield substation services about 60% of the county's distribution. If that were to go down, which we really don't anticipate. 3 days, Harold said. It wasn't a guess. He'd been listening to the farm co-op board meetings for 30 years. He knew what the infrastructure looked like, what the spare equipment inventory was, what the mutual aid agreements were with the neighboring cooperatives. Another pause. That would be a worst case. We're really expecting. Thank you, Harold said, and hung up. He went back to the machine shed, backed the Massey Ferguson out to the apron in front of the doors, and hooked the PTO generator to the 3-point hitch. He connected the drive shaft, the PTO shaft, the telescoping steel tube with its universal joints at each end that connected the tractor's power takeoff to the generator's input, and checked that the shear bolt was intact. Then he covered the whole assembly with a tarpaulin and went back to the porch to watch the storm arrive. It arrived with a spectacle that was, Harold admitted to himself, genuinely impressive. The line of convective cells came visible as a solid wall of cumulonimbus cloud, perhaps 20 miles wide, its anvil top spreading eastward in the stratosphere, its base dropping tendrils of darker cloud that in the flat, wide Indiana sky looked like the fingers of an enormous hand reaching down toward the earth. Lightning flickered continuously in the cloud mass. Not the single flash and wait of ordinary thunderstorms, but a continuous, rolling, branch and fork illumination that turned the undersides of the clouds into something that resembled, briefly and terrifyingly, daylight. The wind hit first, as it always does. Harold felt it on the porch, a hot, strange wind from the south that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, and then switched abruptly to a cold, fierce blast from the northwest that took the wind chimes Ruth had hung on the porch corner in 1974 and turned them into a sustained, dissonant chord. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the time it took Harold to stand up from his chair. Then the rain and the lightning. Harold went inside. The Whitfield substation served the southeastern quadrant of Callaway County, including the Miller Farm, the Hartwell Dairy, the town of Westbrook with its 2,000 residents, the Westbrook Consolidated School District, and some 1,400 individual service accounts. It had been built in 1951 and upgraded in 1968, and it represented the single point of distribution for all electrical power to that part of the county. At 5:23 in the afternoon of August 3, 1984, a lightning strike of approximately 200,000 amperes hit the main transformer of the Whitfield substation, arced across the primary windings, and destroyed the transformer in approximately 1/10 of a second. The automatic circuit breakers disconnected the feeder lines within 40 milliseconds. The lights went out in 1,400 homes and businesses almost simultaneously, with the near-instantaneous uniformity of a candle being snuffed. Harold Miller felt the change before he heard it. The white noise of the electric clock on the kitchen wall ceasing, the slight difference in air quality that comes when the refrigerator compressor stops, the absence of the dozen small electrical sounds that fill a modern home the way tinnitus fills a man's ears, so constant that you don't notice them until they stop. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof and the receding thunder. The storm was moving east now, the main fury already past. A lesser man, or a younger one, might have told himself it was probably just a momentary interruption, that the co-op would have it fixed in an hour, that there was nothing to do but wait. Harold Miller went to the window, looked at the western sky, saw the orange glow of a transformer fire 3 miles away in the direction of the Whitfield substation, and reached for his truck keys. He drove by the substation on his way to town, going slowly past the chain-link fence with his headlights sweeping the damage. What he saw confirmed what the orange glow had suggested. The main transformer housing was blown open, the porcelain insulators shattered, the internal winding assemblies exposed and char-black. A crew from the co-op was already on site, a truck and 3 men in hard hats standing in the rain, talking on a radio. Harold stopped and lowered his window. "How bad?" he called. One of the crew members, a heavy-set fellow with a raincoat and a discouraged expression, walked over. "Main transformer's gone. Have to order a replacement. Lead time." The man pulled off his hard hat and ran a hand over his soaked hair. "At least 72 hours. Maybe 90. There's only 2 of these transformers in the region and the other one's in Columbus, Ohio, and it's spoken for on a different repair job." Harold nodded. He thanked the man and drove to the pay phone at the Westbrook Dairy Queen. He would not own a cordless phone until 1987, and car phones were, in 1984, the province of Indianapolis lawyers and Chicago real estate men, and made 3 phone calls. The first was to the co-op office, which was already recording messages. He left his name and asked them to call him when they had a confirmed timeline. The second was to Tom Decker, to let Tom know what he'd seen at the substation and to ask Tom to spread the word on the county party line, which still existed in the Miller-Decker stretch of Route 46, and which, in circumstances like this, served as the rural telephone network's equivalent of a broadcast tower. The third call was to Dale Hartwell's farm. The line rang 8 times before anyone picked up. When someone finally did, it was not Dale but his hired man, a young fellow named Ronnie Guthrie who had grown up in Westbrook and who had been working at the Hartwell operation for 2 years. "Hartwell Dairy," Ronnie said, and even through the tinny crackle of the line Harold could hear the tension in the young man's voice, the taut, high-pitched quality of someone trying to stay calm and not entirely succeeding. "This is Harold Miller. Is Dale around?" "Mr. Miller, hang on." There was the sound of the receiver being set down, voices in the background, someone cursing in a flat, emphatic way that suggested real crisis rather than ordinary frustration. Then Dale Hartwell's voice, breathless and slightly higher than its normal register. "Hello. Dale, it's Harold Miller. I just drove past the Whitfield substation. Main transformer is out. At least 3 days, maybe more." A silence that lasted several seconds too long. 3 days, Dale said at last. His voice had gone flat in the way that voices go flat when information is too large to be processed in real time. "At least. I'm calling because I remember you mentioned at the co-op meeting in March that you hadn't gotten around to putting in a standby generator yet." Another silence. "No," Dale said. "No, I know. We don't have one." Harold calculated quickly. He'd been past the Hartwell facility several times, had seen the scope of it, had a reasonably accurate mental image of the electrical load, the milking equipment, the refrigeration system, the feeding computer, the ventilation fans that kept 800 cows from cooking in the August heat. "I've got something that might help," Harold said. "I'll come over." "Mr. Miller, Dale's voice broke slightly on the words, a fissure in the flat professional composure that suggested the depth of the water underneath. Mr. Miller, yeah. Yes, please. Harold hung up, got in the truck, and drove back to the farm. What Dale Hartwell did not explain on the phone, but what Harold Miller understood anyway, was the nature of the specific catastrophe that had arrived with the storm. In a modern high-production dairy operation of the type that Dale had built, the dependency on electrical power is so complete, so thoroughly woven into every function of the operation, that the loss of power is not merely an inconvenience. It is an existential emergency. Consider the milk itself. A dairy cow is a biological machine of remarkable efficiency, converting feed into milk at a rate that would impress any engineer. The body of a high-production Holstein, the large-framed, black-and-white breed that had become the dominant commercial dairy breed in America by the 1980s, is structured around the twice-daily cycle of milking, and that structure does not permit deviation. A cow that misses a milking becomes a cow in acute physical distress. Her udder, full of milk that was not removed on schedule, becomes painfully engorged, then inflamed, then infected with the condition known as mastitis, the dairy farmer's particular nightmare, a destroyed quarter, a reduced producer, a potential death if the infection goes systemic. And in Dale Hartwell's barn, on the evening of August 3, 1984, 650 cows had missed their 4 o'clock milking. Beyond the cows themselves, there was the milk already in storage. 5,000 gallons of whole milk. That morning's milking, stored in 6 refrigerated bulk tanks at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, was sitting in those tanks in the Indiana August heat, with no refrigeration running and no way to move it quickly enough to prevent spoilage. The co-op truck that came every other day was not due until tomorrow morning, and even if they called for an emergency pickup, the trucks weren't large enough to take it all. And beyond the milk, there were the cows' basic survival needs. The ventilation fans that moved air through the freestall barn, without which the temperature in the building would climb toward a level that causes heat stress and, eventually, heat death in dairy cattle. The automated waterers. The feeding system. In the old days, the days when Gene Hartwell had run 40 cows through a stanchion barn with a pipeline milker and a 500-gallon bulk tank, a power failure was something you could work around. You could hand milk in a pinch, or at least relieve the worst of the pressure. You could open the barn doors and windows for ventilation. You could carry water in buckets. You could not hand milk 650 high-production Holsteins. You could not ventilate a building the size of a football field with open doors in 90-degree August weather. You could not carry enough water in buckets to keep 800 cows alive for 3 days. Dale Hartwell, standing in his farm office with the emergency lighting from a single battery-backed exit sign, casting a dim orange light over his desk, and the computer that was now as useful as a brick in the bottom drawer where the bourbon lived, understood all of this. He had been running the calculations in his head since the lights went out, and the calculations were not good. He was looking at, conservatively, $30,000 to $40,000 in spoiled milk. He was looking at the potential loss of 50 to 100 cows to heat stress and mastitis if he couldn't get ventilation and milking restored within the next few hours. He was looking at the possibility, the real, concrete, not at all hypothetical possibility, that this event, this one thunderstorm, this one lightning bolt, would be the thing that tipped his operation from barely viable to catastrophically insolvent. He was 31 years old, and he was looking at the end of everything he'd built, and he was scared in a way that he had not been scared since he was a small boy waking from a bad dream, before the world had taught him that grown-ups didn't admit to being scared. He heard the sound of a truck and a flatbed trailer pulling into the farm lane, and he went outside. Harold Miller came through the darkness in his 1978 Ford pickup, his headlights sweeping the gravel drive, and finding Dale Hartwell standing in the barnyard in his coveralls and barn boots, his arms at his sides, and his face doing the complicated thing that faces do when a man is trying to appear calm and failing at it completely. Behind the pickup, on a borrowed flatbed trailer, was the 1964 Massey Ferguson 135. It was not a large tractor. It had never been a large tractor, even in 1964 when Harold had bought it new from Miller Equipment in Seymour for $2,400 cash, a sum that had represented 2 years of careful saving and that Harold had paid with bills from an envelope he'd kept in the sock drawer of the bedroom dresser. The Massey Ferguson 135 was a utility tractor, a workhorse of the small mixed operation, powered by a 3-cylinder Perkins, a 3.152 diesel engine that produced 35 horsepower at the drawbar and 45 at the PTO shaft. It had a narrow front axle, a simple 3-point hitch, and a color scheme: red hood and belly pan, gray engine cover and transmission housing, that had been designed by an industrial designer in Coventry, England, and that had become, in the American Midwest, as familiar a sight as barnwood and wire fence. In its day, and its day had been a long one, the MF-135 had been considered a genuinely capable small farm tractor. By August of 1984, it was 20 years old and the kind of equipment that showed up at farm auctions as a lot item alongside old hand tools and spare parts. Dale Hartwell's operation ran 2 John Deere 4440s and a 4640, machines that dwarfed the old Massey in every dimension: in horsepower, in weight, in sophistication, in the number of hydraulic circuits, and the complexity of their transmission options. Next to them, the MF-135 looked like something from a different world entirely, which, in a way, it was. Behind the MF-135, chained to the flatbed trailer, was the PTO generator in its army green housing. 900 pounds of cast iron and copper winding that Harold had spent his mornings servicing, heavy enough to require a lifting chain and a careful hand on the hoist, old enough to have been manufactured before Korea, solid enough to have 35 years of useful life still left in it, if a man treated it right. Harold got out of the truck slowly. He was 67, and his knees had opinions about cold and damp weather that he tried not to take personally. And he stood in the farmyard looking at Dale Hartwell for a moment without saying anything. "Mr. Miller," Dale said. "I don't." He stopped. "Tried again. I appreciate you coming. I don't know if there's anything that can." "Show me your main electrical panel," Harold said. They walked into the dairy barn together. Harold had a 4-cell flashlight, the old metal kind, with a D-cell that lasted about an hour and felt solid in the hand, not the plastic kind that the hardware stores were starting to sell in 1984, and in its beam he could see the cows in their freestalls, their dark shapes moving restlessly in the hot, airless dark, their breathing audible across the barn in the absence of the ventilation fan's constant drone. The smell was stronger than it should have been, the particular sharp, ammoniac smell of dairy cattle in an enclosed space without air movement. The temperature inside the building was already pushing 90 degrees. The main electrical panel was in a small utility room at the north end of the barn. Harold held the flashlight while Dale opened the panel door, and Harold spent a full minute studying the circuit layout. The main disconnect, the milking parlor circuit, the bulk tank refrigeration circuit, the ventilation circuit, the feed system circuit. He was reading the panel the way a doctor reads an X-ray, assessing priorities, planning the sequence of intervention. "What's the milking parlor draw?" he asked. "About 12 kilowatts for the milking equipment. Maybe 15 with the wash system. Refrigeration? The bulk tanks are 10 kilowatts, maybe 12 on startup." Harold did the arithmetic. His PTO generator was rated at 15 kilowatts continuous output from a properly governed tractor engine. He tested it. He knew exactly what it would do. He could not power the entire operation simultaneously, but he could prioritize. "The refrigeration first," Harold said. "Keep the milk. Then the ventilation fans. Then, when we've got the milk safe, we start on the milking parlor. We'll do it in shifts. You've got 3 hired men. 2 tonight. Ronnie and Steve." Ronnie went home when the power went out and I. "Call Ronnie back," Harold said. "And call whoever else you can reach. We're going to need people." He went back out to the flatbed trailer. What followed, in the next 40 minutes, was a clinic in practical mechanics that several people watched with the kind of focused, silent attention that comes when the machinery being operated is the only thing standing between you and disaster. Harold backed the Massey Ferguson off the flatbed trailer using a pair of aluminum loading ramps. He always kept ramps in the pickup bed. Always, because you never knew when you'd need them. And then used the tractor's 3-point hitch to pick up the generator. The generator had been fitted with an adapter bracket back in 1969 that allowed it to mount on a standard Category 1 3-point hitch. This was not an unusual arrangement. PTO generators had been a common item on farms through the 1940s and 1950s, but it was an arrangement that had become increasingly rare as the years passed, and as the farms that had depended on such equipment had given way to farms that depended entirely on commercial power and never thought to wonder what would happen if that power stopped. He positioned the tractor facing away from the barn's electrical panel so that the PTO shaft could run in a straight line without binding. He lowered the three-point hitch to bring the generator to the correct working height, then connected the PTO shaft, the heavy steel drive shaft, telescoping, with its universal joints at each end and its splined couplings. The PTO shaft on the Massey Ferguson was a 6-spline, 1 3/8-inch shaft that engaged with a matching spline socket on the generator's input. Harold slid the shaft home, depressed the locking collar, heard the click that meant it was seated, and double-checked by pulling back. Solid. He ran a 4/0 aluminum service entrance cable, 200 feet of it, rolled on a wooden spool he'd brought on the trailer, because he had estimated the distance correctly from memory, from the generator's output terminals across the farmyard to the dairy barn's main disconnect. He connected it to the quick connect lugs he'd installed on the generator's output box back in 1969. He checked the connections twice, then 3 times. Ronnie Guthrie had arrived by this time, driving fast up the county road with his truck windows down, his face still showing the embarrassment of having left when the crisis started. He stood watching Harold work, saying nothing, which was the right response. Steve, the other hired man, a big, phlegmatic fellow from Brownstown who had been in this county all his life and who had helped his father with enough farm emergencies to know what useful help looked like, stood on the other side, holding the flashlight steady without being asked. Dale Hartwell stood to the side and watched. He had stopped trying to be in charge, which was, Harold reflected, the smartest decision Dale had made that evening. "Before I start her up," Harold said, his voice carrying across the farmyard in the quiet that comes after a storm has moved through, "I need you to go to your electrical panel and disconnect everything except the bulk tank refrigeration circuit. We'll power the refrigeration first, then add loads as we can. You understand what?" Dale nodded, and Harold could see that he did understand, that his agricultural economics degree was useful for something after all. Motor loads, especially refrigeration compressors, have a startup surge that can be 5 or 6 times their running load, Harold said, not because Dale necessarily didn't know it, but because Steve and Ronnie were listening and might not, and because a man should always explain what he's doing and why. "We're going to bring the refrigeration up first, by itself, so the tractor can handle the startup surge without stalling. Once it's running and we've got the load stabilized, then we add the ventilation fans one at a time." He climbed up onto the MF-135. The seat was original equipment, a formed steel unit with a rubber pad that had cracked along one edge and been repaired with a strip of electrician's tape sometime in the mid-1970s. The steering wheel was worn smooth in a pattern that exactly matched Harold Miller's grip, the calluses on his palms, the pressure points of 40 years of driving this tractor. He reached forward and turned the key. The Perkins, a 3.152 diesel, started on the third crank with the reliable solidity of an engine that has been properly maintained and has not been asked to do anything unreasonable. Harold let it warm for 2 minutes. He always let it warm before putting a load on it, had done so his entire life, the habit so deeply ingrained that he could not have violated it any more than he could have willfully forgotten his own name. Watching the temperature gauge climb, listening to the exhaust notes settle from its cold morning clatter into the smooth, even diesel sound that he knew as well as he knew his own voice. He looked at Steve, who nodded. Panel was ready. Harold engaged the PTO. The Massey Ferguson's PTO engagement was a simple, elegant mechanism. A hand lever on the left side of the transmission case, a multi-plate clutch inside, a controlled engagement that, in the hands of an experienced operator, could be modulated as smoothly as a dance step. Harold brought it in gradually, feeling the load come up through the seat and the steering wheel and the throttle. You feel a tractor like you feel a horse, through every point of contact, and 40 years of operating this particular machine had given Harold a fluency in its language that was as natural as breathing. He watched the tachometer and gave the engine more fuel as the generator came up to speed, finding the sweet spot, coaxing the old machine into its working stride. The generator output frequency depended on the tractor's engine speed. 460-cycle AC power, the standard for American residential and commercial use. The tractor engine needed to run at a speed that drove the generator at exactly 1,800 revolutions per minute. Harold set this by tachometer, adjusting the throttle with small, precise movements until the reading was right. It took him about 30 seconds. Then he nodded to Dale. Dale threw the bulk tank refrigeration breaker. The 6 refrigeration compressors across the barn had been silent for 23 minutes. They were warm, the milk in the tanks already beginning to drift above the safe storage temperature. When the power hit them, they drew a combined startup surge that would have tripped a smaller generator instantly or stalled a lesser engine without ceremony. Harold felt the load hit, felt the tractor pull against it, felt the engine note deepen and the RPMs try to drop like a horse hitting a hill. And he gave it more throttle, smooth and steady, the way you urge a draft horse into a heavy collar. Not sudden, not jerky, but firm and confident, and with complete faith that the machine will find its feet if you give it room to do so. The engine found its feet. The tachometer steadied. The generator output stabilized at 118 volts. In the bulk tank room, one by one, the green indicator lights on the 6 refrigerated storage tanks came on. Dale Hartwell was looking through the window of the bulk tank room at those lights. Harold couldn't see his face clearly from where he was sitting, but he could see the set of Dale's shoulders change, the rigid, braced quality going out of them, replaced with something that was not quite relaxation, but was at least the release of the very worst of the tension. 5,000 gallons of milk, representing 2 days of the farm's most critical output, was going to survive the night. Ronnie Guthrie let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for an hour. Ventilation next, Harold called. Add the fans one at a time. Call out when each one's running. They added the ventilation fans in sequence, starting with the in-wall exhaust fans and working toward the sidewall inlets. Harold watched the electrical load grow with each addition, gave the engine more throttle as each fan came online, and maintained his 1,800 revolutions per minute set point by feel and by tachometer and by the knowledge that had accumulated in him over 4 decades of operating this machine. It was not mechanical knowledge alone. It was something more than that, a kind of intimate understanding that comes only from long practice with a specific tool, the way a master craftsman knows the grain of a particular piece of wood without measuring it. When the ventilation system was running, the ambient temperature in the freestall barn began to drop almost immediately. The night air had cooled to the low 70s, much cooler than the barn's accumulated heat, and the fans moved it in a steady, purposeful flow. The cows, which had been restless and audibly uncomfortable, began to settle. Harold listened to the change in the barn's sounds, the diminishing of the nervous shifting and lowing, the gradual replacement of animal distress with the ordinary nighttime quiet of dairy cattle finding their rest. Then the milking parlor. Milking 650 cows in a double 12 parallel parlor takes, under normal conditions, approximately 3.5 hours with an experienced crew. Harold Miller had never operated a parallel milking parlor in his life. His dairy experience was with a stanchion barn and a pipeline system. The old way, the way Gene Hartwell had done it for 30 years before his son had decided that the old way was no longer sufficient. But Harold understood the principles, and Ronnie and Steve understood the operation, and Dale understood everything. What they didn't have was enough generator capacity to run everything at once. The vacuum pump is the critical load, Harold said. He was standing in the milk room, his flashlight playing over the mechanical equipment with the methodical sweep of a man taking inventory. How big? 7.5 horse, Ronnie said. Single phase. And the milk pump? 2 horse. Harold did the numbers. Run the vacuum pump and the milk pump together, he said. I can add the wash system at the end when the milking's done. What takes priority after the cows are milked? The cows, Dale said quietly. He said it with a simplicity that Harold recognized as something hard-won. The voice of a man who had just spent 23 minutes contemplating the loss of everything and had arrived, through that ordeal, at a clarity about what actually mattered. We need to milk the cows. The milk in the tanks is safe now. We need to milk the cows. Harold looked at Dale for a moment. The dairy farmer was standing under the battery-backed emergency light, his coveralls damp from rain and sweat, his face showing something that Harold recognized from a long acquaintance with mirrors. The look of a man who has been reminded, harshly and without warning, that the bottom line is not always the bottom line. Then let's milk cows, Harold said. They milked from 8:30 in the evening until a few minutes past midnight. The Massey Ferguson ran without complaint, the Perkins diesel ticking off the hours with its steady, 4-square cadence. The sound of a properly maintained engine doing the work it was designed to do. Unhurried, unfussed, as reliable as gravity. The exhaust pipe glowed faintly orange in the dark farmyard. The stars came out after the storm moved through, the Indiana August sky enormous overhead, and the Milky Way visible in a way that it rarely was from anywhere near a town. Harold sat on the tractor for the first 2 hours, monitoring the load and adjusting the throttle as the milking parlor equipment cycled through its demand variations. Then he let Steve take over the throttle watch. Steve had good hands and a natural feel for the machine, and Harold showed him the tachometer point and what to listen for in the engine note, while Harold walked the operation and checked connections and listened to the generator for anything in its sound that might indicate a developing problem. There was no developing problem. The generator ran as it had always run, as its designers had intended it to run, as it had been built to run in an era when things were built to run indefinitely rather than to last only until the next model was released. Ronnie ran the milking parlor with the quiet, efficient motion of a young man who has done this same work so many times that his hands know the protocol without consulting his conscious mind. He attached the milking units, checked teat ends for mastitis signs, dipped post-milking, moved methodically to the next cow, maintaining the rhythm that is the difference between a 2-hour job and a 3-hour job. Dale worked the other side of the parlor. Steve managed the cow flow, moving animals in and out in groups of 12, keeping the operation moving with the steady authority of someone who respects large animals enough to handle them quietly. By 10 o'clock, the most acute crisis had passed. The milk was safe. The cows were being milked on a modified schedule. The barn temperature had dropped to a level where the animals could breathe without distress. Dale Hartwell's farm was, against all probability and in defiance of all the things that could have gone differently, still functioning. At midnight, they finished the last of the cows. Harold pulled the PTO out of engagement and let the Massey Ferguson idle down. In the sudden relative quiet, the generator winding down, the milking equipment stopping, the ventilation fan still running but the loudest sounds gone. The night insects of an Indiana August were audible. The cicadas in the fence rose, the frogs in the drainage ditch along the county road, the nighthawks calling somewhere over the cornfield to the east. The sounds of a summer night in a county where the land had been farmed for a century and the fields and the fence rows had worked out, over all those years, a complex and irreplaceable arrangement with the creatures that lived in them. Harold climbed down from the tractor. His knees registered their standard protest. He walked to the tailgate of his truck and poured coffee from the thermos he'd brought from home. He always brought a thermos, had done so since 1961, because there is no situation so dire that a cup of coffee does not improve it, at least marginally. And he offered a cup to Dale Hartwell, who took it and held it in both hands without drinking it for a long moment. 3 days, Dale said. You said 3 days. About that, Harold said. Dale looked at the Massey Ferguson, idling in the yard, its exhaust notes steady in the still night air. How much fuel does it burn? About 1.5 gallons an hour at this load. Maybe 2 gallons at peak. Dale nodded. He had diesel fuel. He had a 500-gallon tank for his own equipment, and that was not the problem. The problem, or rather, the question, the thing that was working its way up through all the layers of crisis management and practical calculation to demand an answer, was something different from a logistics question. Why did you come? Dale asked. Not ungratefully. The question carried genuine puzzlement, the bewilderment of a young man trying to understand the motivations of an old one, trying to fit what he had just witnessed into a framework of human behavior that his education and his ambition had not prepared him to understand. Harold drank his coffee. The question deserved a real answer, not a polite deflection. Because you needed help, he said. And because I had something that could help. But Dale stopped. Started again, with the visible effort of a man who is not accustomed to admitting things. I wasn't very. When you suggested at the co-op meeting in March that we should think about backup power, I said the reliability numbers made it an unnecessary expense. You did, Harold said. He said it without reproach. He remembered it clearly. The March meeting at the Westbrook Grange Hall, the folding metal chairs, and the smell of the coffee urn that had been running since before the meeting started, and the particular way Dale had said it, with the breezy confidence of a man whose spreadsheets tell him he is right, and who has not yet learned that spreadsheets do not include the weather. You weren't wrong about the reliability record, Harold said. You were wrong about the inference. A reliable system and an infallible system are not the same thing. And when you build something that can only survive in perfect conditions, you've built something that will fail the first time conditions aren't perfect. Dale was quiet for a long moment. The Nighthawks called again over the cornfield. No, he said at last. They're not. The same thing. He paused. I understand that now. The Massey Ferguson ran for 71 hours. Harold Miller drove the 2 miles between his farm and the Hartwell dairy 6 times a day. Morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night, and the small hours. Sometimes to operate the tractor himself, sometimes just to check on it. To listen to the engine with the particular attention of long familiarity, to feel the vibration of the drive shaft and know by the quality of that vibration that everything was as it should be. He brought fuel from his own tank. He brought tools and spare belts and a timing light, though he never needed the timing light. He brought coffee in the thermos and, on the second day, a casserole in a covered dish that he identified, when Ronnie Guthrie asked, as tuna noodle, made from a recipe of Ruth's that he had memorized not because he had expected to need it, but because memorizing Ruth's recipes had seemed, after she died, like a form of preservation, a way of keeping something of her alive in the house where they had lived together for 26 years. He ate the casserole with Ronnie at the break table in the milk room. On the second afternoon, while Dale was in the farm office making phone calls to the co-op, to the lenders, to the milk co-op, to the equipment company whose computer was sitting dark and useless in the corner of the office. Ronnie was 23 years old, a year younger than Harold had been when he'd taken over the farm from his father, and he had the particular quality that Harold associated with young men who had grown up around farming, a physical competence, an ease in the presence of large animals and heavy machinery, combined with a bewilderment at the larger economic forces that had turned the agricultural world of 1984 into something unrecognizable from the one that same land had supported 20 years before. My dad lost his farm in '82, Ronnie said. He said it without drama, the way you describe a fact that has become too familiar to sting every time, though it still does. Had 100 acres over on the Sullivan County line. Bank took it after 2 bad years in a row. Dad had borrowed against the land value in '79 when the land was worth $1,200 an acre, and by '82 it was worth $600, and the bank called the note. Harold nodded. He had heard this story enough times by 1984 that the specifics, the year, the county, the acreage, the price per acre, had become almost interchangeable, the way that the individual stories of soldiers in a war become interchangeable without losing their weight. The weight remained. It had been accumulating in Callaway County, and in every county like it across the Corn Belt, for 5 years now. Your dad doing okay? Works at the auto parts place in Brownstown. Ronnie looked at his coffee cup. Says he likes it. A pause. I don't think he likes it. Harold didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say about a man who had farmed his whole life and was now counting out fan belts and asking customers whether they needed windshield washer fluid. Some griefs had to be felt, not fixed, and the person sitting with you needed to know that you understood the difference. Mr. Miller, Ronnie said, after a while. That tractor out there, how old is it? 20 years come October. Bought it in '64. And it just works. I keep it up, Harold said. A machine will work as long as you're willing to care for it. The caring is most of it. Ronnie looked out through the milk room window at the Massey Ferguson, visible through the glass as a red and gray shape in the afternoon light, its exhaust pipe sending a thin thread of diesel smoke into a clear Indiana sky. I never learned the old stuff, Ronnie said. The PTO generators, the hand tools, all of that. By the time I was growing up, it was all plug-in, all automatic. My grandfather had a cream separator. We kept it in the basement like a museum piece. That's not your fault, Harold said. No, but Ronnie struggled with something. If somebody around here had known how this stuff worked, Mr. Hartwell wouldn't have been in the situation he was in. We shouldn't have needed you to come save us. It should have been us that knew how to do this. He shook his head. We forgot things we didn't know we'd need. Harold considered that for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. Most things worth knowing, you learn before you need them, he said. That's what preparation means. But the second best time to learn is right now. He finished his coffee, set down the cup, and nodded toward the yard. Come on, I'll show you how the shaft coupling works, and how to read the generator load on the tachometer. and what to listen for when the engine's struggling. He stood up and reached for his cap. A man should know what makes his lights come on. The power came back on the 71st hour, at 2:47 in the afternoon of August 6th. Harold was in his kitchen eating lunch, leftover tuna noodle casserole, and a glass of iced tea, when the electric clock on the wall began to blink 12 o'clock in the way that electric clocks blink when power is restored, and the refrigerator compressor kicked on with its familiar startup sound, and the radio on the counter, a Zenith AM set that had been on the kitchen counter since 1965, through presidents and crises and market collapses and harvests good and bad, came back to life in the middle of a Farm Bureau news report about the milk diversion program. Harold finished his lunch, washed his bowl, and drove to the Hartwell dairy. They shut down the Massey Ferguson together. Dale disengaged the PTO shaft from the generator while Harold watched, checking the procedure without comment, because Ronnie had shown Dale the coupling protocol that morning and Dale had been paying attention and performed it correctly. When the shaft was disconnected and the generator was capped, Harold drove the MF-135 around to the flatbed trailer and loaded it back up while Dale and Ronnie stood in the late afternoon sun. The August light was long and golden over the fields, the particular quality of Indiana afternoon light in early August that lies somewhere between summer and the first intimation of autumn. The light that, for anyone who grew up on a farm in this part of the country, carries in it the accumulated memory of 1,000 August afternoons spent doing the endless, necessary, deeply satisfying work of the land. "How much do I owe you?" Dale asked, when Harold had the tractor loaded and the chains secured. Harold looked at him. "For what?" "For..." Dale spread his hands slightly, taking in the farmyard, the barn, the milk tanks, the cows moving in their free stalls, everything that still existed because of the past 71 hours. "For this. For saving this place." "Don't owe me anything," Harold said. "Mr. Miller, you need to let me." "Dale." Harold said it the way he would have said it to one of his own sons, with the particular finality that closes a topic without closing a relationship. "I came and helped a neighbor. That's what you do when a neighbor needs help and you have what they need. I wasn't doing you a favor. I was doing what a neighbor does." He paused, fastening the last of the trailer chains. "You can bring back the extension cord when you get a chance. I'll need that back eventually." Dale looked like he was going to say something else. He worked at it for a moment and then said something different from what he'd intended, something truer. "My father tried to tell me something when he handed over the farm. He said don't mess with it more than you have to. I thought he was being old-fashioned. I thought he didn't understand what farming had to become to survive in the modern market." He paused. "I'm starting to understand what he meant." Harold considered this for a moment. "Gene's a smart man," he said, "and he knows something that takes some people longer to learn than others. That a system which works is worth more than a system which is impressive. Impressive can fail. Working just keeps on working." He climbed into the truck. He had one more thing he wanted to say, and he said it through the lowered window as he started the engine. "There's a wind power generator like mine at the Brinkman Estate sale in Bartholomew County 3rd Saturday of September. I already called the estate agent, and it's going to auction. I'd guess it brings $40 or $50. I'd suggest you be there." Dale nodded slowly. "I'll be there," he said. Harold drove home. The summer of 1984 did not end the farm crisis. The summer of 1984 did not stop the foreclosures or calm the interest rates or raise the commodity prices or prevent the bankruptcies of farm families all across the Corn Belt that would continue through 1985 and 1986 and into 1987. Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp and Neil Young held the first Farm Aid concert on the University of Illinois campus in Champaign in September of 1985, and 100,000 people came, and it raised $9 million and proved that people cared, even if caring was not the same thing as solving the underlying problem: too much debt, too little margin, too much faith in permanent prosperity, did not yield to concerts. It yielded, slowly and with great cost to great numbers of people, to time and to the hard work of policy and to the gradual rebuilding of what had been broken. Some of what was broken could not be rebuilt. Some of the farms that were lost in those years never came back to family ownership. Some of the men who lost them never recovered, in any full sense of that word, from the loss. But some survived. Dale Hartwell survived. He sold 200 cows in the fall of 1984 and renegotiated 2 of his loans with the FMHA, the Farmers Home Administration, which had been created during the New Deal to help exactly the kind of farmer who now sat across the desk from its officers with exactly the kind of problem Dale Hartwell had. The process was humbling in the way that necessary processes sometimes are. The sitting in waiting rooms, the explaining of decisions that in retrospect were clearly wrong, the acceptance of terms that his 1983 self would have found unacceptable. He went through it, and he came out the other side still farming. He hired Brad Kowalski's predecessor at the extension office, a quiet, gray-haired man named Ed Weston who had worked with farmers for 30 years and who had a very different relationship with the word efficiency than Brad did, to help him review his operation. Ed Weston's definition of efficiency included resilience, redundancy, and the ability to function when something went wrong, which put him somewhat outside the mainstream of 1980s agricultural economics, but very much in line with what Dale Hartwell now understood from direct experience to be true. By 1986, Dale had a backup generator, a proper standby unit, diesel-powered, with an automatic transfer switch, installed by an electrician from Seymour. He had paid for it himself, without borrowing, which had required an economy of spending that would have been unthinkable to his 1983 self. He did not tell anyone this, but he felt better about that particular expenditure than about almost any other financial decision he had made in his career. He had also, at the Brinkman Estate auction in September of 1984, paid $55 for a wind power PTO generator very similar to Harold Miller's, and had it serviced and stored in his machine shed, where it sat as a reminder of the things a man should not need to be reminded of. He called Gene Hartwell in Martinsville and asked his father if he'd like to come for a visit. Gene drove up on a Saturday in October, when the leaves were turning gold and orange along the creek bottoms, and the air had the particular clarity of Indiana autumn, and they sat on the porch of the farmhouse together for an afternoon and talked about cows and about farming and about the things a man learns from his mistakes if he is paying attention and the things he misses if he is not. They sat there until the sun went down behind the treeline to the west, and then Dale's wife brought them supper, and they ate at the kitchen table under the overhead light that came from the Rural Electric Cooperative's perfectly reliable power line, and they were grateful for it. Harold also, in a way that was not public knowledge and never became public knowledge, quietly paid the first month's rent on a small house in Westbrook for the family of a young farmer named Carter who had lost his place in March of 1984 and had 3 children under 10 and a wife who had been trying to hold things together with the kind of steadiness that women on farms develop across generations and that does not get written about in the agricultural economics journals. He never mentioned this to anyone. Carter found out years later, in a roundabout way, and drove out to the Miller farm to say something about it. Harold offered him a cup of coffee, and they talked about crop prices for half an hour, and Harold said, "Well, it was good to see you," and Carter drove home. Ronnie Guthrie was hired as farm manager of the Hartwell dairy operation in January of 1985, at a raise of 40% over his previous wage. Dale paid for Ronnie to take a 2-day course at the Purdue Extension in Lafayette on generator maintenance and PTO power systems, and Ronnie came back from that course with a notebook full of diagrams and specifications and a quality of confidence in his work that had not been there before. The confidence that comes from understanding, not just from habit, the machines that you depend upon. He also spent 3 afternoons that fall at Harold Miller's farm, going through the equipment lot, asking questions, listening to the answers. Harold was not a man who lectured. He explained what things were, and what they did, and what a man needed to know to keep them working. Ronnie took notes, which Harold did not do when he was Ronnie's age because such knowledge was common enough that it didn't need writing down. Times had changed. What Harold Miller understood, watching Ronnie Guthrie take notes about the operating principles of a 1940s PTO generator, was that what had seemed for a generation like useless old knowledge was in fact irreplaceable knowledge that had simply been mislaid, set aside in the rush toward the new, pushed back into the corner of the machine shed along with the machines themselves, deemed unnecessary by a world that had not yet learned what it would someday need. The world always learns, eventually. The question is always whether it learns before or after the crisis, and at what cost. In the spring of 1985, the Callaway County Farm Bureau invited Harold Miller to speak at their annual meeting on the subject of emergency preparedness for agricultural operations. He said no thank you. They asked Brad Kowalski to speak instead, and Brad gave a very competent presentation about backup power systems and generator specifications and transfer switch ratings, illustrated with slides from a Kodak carousel projector. In the summer of 1985, when the Delaney Farms combined drive belt shredded at the start of the soybean harvest and Harold happened to have a length of the correct V-belt specification hanging on a nail beside his workbench. The belt had been there since 1971, when he'd ordered an extra as a matter of habit. He handed it to Jack Delaney's son without discussion, and they went back to harvesting. In the fall of 1986, when the co-op power went out for 6 hours during a November ice storm, 3 farms in the county ran through the outage on PTO generators that they had acquired in the 2 years since August of 1984. The milk was fine. The co-op crew, arriving to restore the line, found the 3 farm operations running as normally as weather permitted and did not at first understand why, until one of them, the heavy-set fellow with the raincoat, the same one Harold had talked to in the road 2 years before, noticed the old tractor in the lot of the Miller farm and understood. On the morning of August 4, 1984, while the Massey Ferguson was still running in the Hartwell farmyard, a woman named Edith Kowalski, Brad's mother, a sturdy woman in her mid-60s who had grown up on a farm in Bartholomew County and who was driving past on her way to visit her sister in Westbrook, had pulled her Buick to the side of the road and gotten out to look. She had stood for a long moment looking at the old red tractor and the army green generator and the heavy cable running across the farmyard toward the dairy barn, and at the 3 men visible through the milking parlor windows going about their work, and at the patient Holsteins waiting in the pre-dawn for their turn. She had said, not to anyone in particular, "My father had one of those." Ronnie Guthrie, who had been standing near the yard gate on a break, had looked at her. "A PTO generator?" "Yes. He bought it after the ice storm of 1948 took the power out for 4 days." She was quiet for a moment, her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the Massey Ferguson. "He used to say you could do more with a good tractor and a working brain than with $1 million worth of equipment that depended on someone else's power line." She stood there another minute, looking at the tractor, its diesel exhaust steady in the morning air, its old engine holding its 1,800 revolutions per minute the way it had always held it, the way it had been maintained and cared for to hold it across 20 years of Indiana seasons. And then she got back in her car. She told the story to her sister over coffee that morning, and her sister told it to her husband, and her husband told it to the men at the Westbrook hardware store, and the hardware store owner, a man named Bert who had been in business since 1961, told it to every farmer who came in for the rest of that week. By the time the power came back on Tuesday afternoon, most of the county knew what had happened and who had made it happen. Nobody asked Harold Miller to speak at any meetings. Nobody gave him an award that summer. Nobody wrote an article in the Farm Bureau newsletter about what he'd done. Harold did not want any of these things, which was one of the reasons nobody offered them. There is a quality in certain quiet men that communicates, without words. That recognition is not the currency they trade in, and that offering it would be a kind of misunderstanding. What they did, the farmers of Callaway County, was something more practical than recognition. They went to their machine sheds and their equipment lots, and they looked, some of them for the first time in years, at what was there. They found things they had forgotten they had. They called neighbors who knew about old machines and asked questions that they had thought were no longer worth asking. They went to estate sales with more attention than they had previously paid to the lots in the back rows, the dusty iron that the auction companies listed as miscellaneous equipment, and that sold for $10 and $15 to the handful of old men who knew what they were looking at. Some of them found PTO generators. Some of them found other things. All of them found something worth keeping that they had not known they needed. The 1964 Massey Ferguson 135 is still on the Miller farm. Harold's son Gary, who came back from Indianapolis in 1991 to take over the property after Harold's health began to decline, keeps it in the machine shed under a canvas tarpaulin. He starts it every spring, lets it warm for 2 minutes, runs it for an hour while he checks the oil and greases the fittings and listens to the engine note for anything that should not be there. He does not know, quite, why he does this. The farm is leased out now, Gary working in town, coming home on weekends to keep up with things. There is no operational need for a 40-year-old utility tractor. There are people who would give him good money for it at an auction, and the money would be useful, and the machine shed could use the space. He has not sold it. His daughter, who is 9, sometimes climbs up onto the seat when Gary is servicing it, and sits there with her hands on the worn steering wheel, and asks him what it does, and Gary tells her what he knows of the story. About the August night in 1984, about the storm and the darkness, and the 5,000 gallons of milk that should have been lost and were not. About an old man who had kept a machine that everyone else had decided was useless and who had known, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has paid attention to the world for 70 years, that it would be needed. She is 9, and she listens with the particular intensity that children bring to stories in which adults are imperfect, and one quiet person knows something important that everyone else has overlooked. She presses her hands flat on the steering wheel and looks out through the open machine shed door at the fields that her great-grandfather farmed, and she says, "He just kept it?" "He just kept it," Gary says, "because he thought he might need it someday, because he knew that needing it was possible, and he figured possible was enough." She thinks about this in the way that 9-year-olds think about things that adults have learned to stop thinking about, because thinking about them is too simple and too difficult at the same time. Then she says, "That seems smart." Gary smiles and reaches past her to check the coolant level. "Yeah," he says, "it does. The old machines know things we have forgotten. The men who built them, who ran them, who maintained them through drought and flood and economic collapse and the long, ordinary labor of American farm life, knew things that the newer, faster, shinier world had not yet learned it needed to know again. Some of that knowledge was saved. Some of it was saved by the Harold Millers of the world, the quiet men with oil-stained hands and machine sheds full of things that most people had decided were useless, who went on maintaining their machines and their knowledge against the day when someone, somewhere, would need exactly what they had, and who never, not once, made another man feel small for needing it. That is a kind of generosity that does not get called generosity, because it looks, from the outside, like stubbornness, like being out of date, like refusing to let go of the past. What it is, from the inside, is something else entirely. It is the patient, undemonstrative conviction that the world is not as reliable as it seems, that the grid can go down, that the storm can come, that the things you know and the tools you maintain are the difference, at the critical hour, between disaster and survival. Harold Miller's grandfather came from the Rhineland with $20 and learned to read a sky and a soil that were entirely foreign to him. Harold Miller's father kept horses for 3 years after he bought his first tractor, because he understood that the day might come when the tractor's engine would be unavailable and the horse's biological engine would not. Harold Miller kept a generator in the corner of his machine shed for 15 years, serviced and ready, because he had listened to enough co-op board meetings and watched enough August skies to know that reliable is not the same as infallible, and that the difference between those two words is exactly the space in which disaster lives and preparation prevents it. This is what farmers know, the ones who have farmed long enough and paid close enough attention, that the land does not care about your debts or your ambitions or your spreadsheets or your plans. The land has been here longer than you have and will be here after you are gone. Your job, while you are here, is to understand it as completely as you can, to prepare for its contingencies, to build your operation to be resilient rather than merely impressive, to maintain the old knowledge even when the world tells you it is no longer necessary. Especially then,